Hello, my name is Connie Nicholson, and I'm with North Fresno Church in Fresno, California. This summer, our study is entitled Reading Scripture with Discernment. We're in the second week of our 4-week unit called The Rich Literature of the Bible. Last week, we looked at text from Deuteronomy and Matthew to hear God speaking to us through the law of Moses and the life of Jesus as he fulfilled the law. We considered how, through the law, we are formed into a loving, just, and generous community who follow in the way of Jesus, and how we keep our priorities of loving God and loving neighbor. As I shared last week, we're pairing two scriptures together during this unit, one from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament, to provide us with deeper discernment and understanding of what God is speaking through Jesus into our Old Testament texts. So today, we're going to be studying how God speaks to us through the prophets. We'll be examining an Old Testament prophecy in the book of Malachi and the fulfillment of that prophecy in the Gospel of Luke. The prophetic literature of the Bible, in my mind, has kind of these two layers to it. There's a level at which God is speaking through the prophets to the people of God within the specific historical context in which the message from God is being delivered. So it's to a people for a specific season. And then there's a level of how God is still speaking through this prophetic text to you and me today. The writers of our curriculum do an excellent job of situating our Malachi text into a historical framework, highlighting things like the shofar in the Old Testament and discussing the objects Jesus uses in Luke. So be sure to spend time studying that. But I especially want to highlight two important insights that Professor Geddert gives in our lesson before you jump into the Malachi text. The first thing I want you to remember is that he says, quote, "The purpose of these Old Testament prophetic texts is to call God's people back to covenant faithfulness with our God," end quote. That's a quote worth writing on your whiteboard as you begin your lesson. As Professor Geddert explains in his ice cream story, prophecy is a promise from a loving God and meant to draw us back into our covenant with God. And the second important insight I want you to remember as you're reading is the difference between God predicting the future and God planning the future. Predicting the future has this kind of a disconnection to it, and almost an uncaring feel to it, whereas to plan for the future requires an involvement, participation, and action. So whether you're listening to the prophetic text of Malachi within a historical framework, or you're reading the prophetic text with present-day ears, listen to how God is speaking through the prophets, then and now, to draw God's people, you and I, back to God's self, and then listen for the gem of hope that continues to be spoken every time these prophecies are read. The hope that God promises to stay true to God's side of the covenant with us. Our Old Testament text today comes from the book of Malachi, the last book of the Old Testament, in which Malachi prophesies someone who will be preparing the way of the Lord. Malachi 3, verses 1 through 4. Malachi, it's a post-exilic text, meaning the book was written to the broken people of Judah after their return from Babylonian exile. Their country has been leveled, their faith was hanging by threads. Now remember, if one of the purposes of prophecy is to bring God's people back to covenant faithfulness, then we get to read this text through a context of hope and trust that God is faithful to God's promises. It is often the prophets who are the ones reminding the covenanted people of these very promises with words of encouragements and warnings. Prophets do not only speak doom and gloom, they also speak hope and promise. Last week, we read in Matthew that Jesus claimed he fulfilled and completed the Old Testament law and words of the prophets. In the Discover section of your lesson today, I would encourage you to spend time considering how Jesus and John the Baptist fulfilled Malachi's prophetic words. This section of Malachi can be read as a prophetic proclamation of John the Baptist and Jesus. But at a different level, this prophetic utterance was perhaps also heard as a word of hope to a people who had felt betrayed and abandoned. It was God wooing God's people back to God's self. Not unlike our own culture, where people are asking, where is God, and is God real, and is there any hope? These prophetic texts share with us the hope that we have in God, whose loving kindness continues to be at work in our world, renewing all things. So after you've spent time in the book of Malachi, now we're going to turn to the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7. John the Baptist is in prison at this point of the story, and he sends his disciples to Jesus to ask if Jesus really is the one sent from God. They say, "Are you really the Messiah?" What the Jews expected the Messiah to do and be about was in stark contrast to Jesus. John is questioning Jesus' Messianic presence because he's not setting up his kingdom like the Jews expected. In verses 24 through 35, Jesus uses a variety of imagery to cast a vision for who and why the people are following Jesus. Without saying he's the Messiah, he says he's the Messiah. And without naming Herod, Jesus covertly explains the fulfillment of this Malachi text. So take some time studying the images and the objects Jesus uses and how he fulfills that Old Testament prophecy. This lesson is deep and rich as we continue to hear God speak to us through the prophets and through our Gospels. So may we be people who continue to carry on the work of Jesus, bringing greater and greater fulfillment to what God has promised, while offering this beautiful hope to our world that God is faithful.